The crowded city bus screeched to a stop on a bustling downtown street, its doors wheezing open. Commuters, bundled in coats against the chilly morning air, shuffled aboard one by one. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a poised woman in her early 70s. Her back was straight, her chin held high, and her steady gaze reflected a quiet strength. As she ascended the steps, Evelyn clutched her handbag tightly, offering a polite nod to the bus driver, Robert Whitman. Whitman barely acknowledged her, his scowl deepening as Evelyn deposited her fare into the collection box. She took a moment to steady herself before proceeding toward an open seat near the front. "Move it along!" Whitman barked, his tone gruff and irritated. Evelyn glanced at him briefly, her expression neutral, and continued to make her way forward. Gripping the pole for balance as the bus jolted into motion, she scanned the other passengers, their faces subdued and weary in the morning light. "Not there!" Whitman's voice cut sharply through the murmur of the bus, halting Evelyn mid-step. He pointed aggressively toward the back. "Seats up front aren't for you. Move to the rear." The atmosphere inside the bus shifted. A woman near the window lowered her gaze, pulling her young child closer. An elderly man fidgeted with his newspaper, suddenly engrossed. Evelyn turned to face Whitman, her calm demeanor unbroken. "I've paid my fare," she replied evenly. "I will sit where I choose." Whitman's jaw clenched as he abruptly slammed the brakes, causing the bus to lurch violently. Passengers scrambled to steady themselves, clutching poles and seats. Whitman rose from his seat, pointing an accusatory finger at Evelyn. "You don't make the rules here, lady. Either move to the back or get off my bus. That's your choice," he growled. A ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while a young man in the middle rows raised his phone, the faint glow of its camera beginning to record. Evelyn, unshaken, stood her ground. "I'm staying right here," she declared, her voice steady. Whitman's face reddened with fury. Grabbing his radio, he barked into it. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I've got a passenger refusing to comply. Send transit security to my location." The tension in the air thickened, every passenger acutely aware of the standoff unfolding. Evelyn remained steadfast, her fingers lightly gripping the cool metal rail. Around her, whispers grew louder, the discomfort among the commuters palpable. Whitman stomped toward her, his uniform taut against his frame, his frustration brimming. "You think you're special," he sneered. "I make the rules on this bus. If I say move, you move." Evelyn met his glare without flinching. "You're wrong, and you know it," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not breaking any rules." Whitman's frustration boiled over. "You're disturbing everyone here. People have places to be." He gestured toward the passengers as if seeking their agreement. Most avoided eye contact, their expressions betraying discomfort or quiet disapproval. From the middle of the bus, the young man with the phone spoke up, his voice clear. "She's not the one holding us up, man. You are." Whitman's glare shifted to the man. "Stay out of this," he snapped. But the young man didn't lower his phone, continuing to record as the confrontation escalated. Whitman stormed back to his seat, his anger evident in every heavy step. Gripping the radio again, he repeated his demand for security. The faint hum of the bus engine filled the tense silence, broken only by occasional whispers. "Why is he making such a fuss?" a woman near the back muttered under her breath. Evelyn turned toward the passengers, her voice calm yet resolute. "This isn't just about me," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs. "It's about standing up for what's right." Whitman spun around, his face twisted in anger. "Enough with the speeches," he barked. "You're off this bus the moment security gets here." A young boy sitting with his mother tugged at her sleeve, his voice a curious whisper. "Why is the driver yelling at her, Mommy?" The mother hushed him, glancing nervously at Whitman. Evelyn offered the boy a kind smile. "Sometimes, when people know they're wrong, they don't like being challenged," she said gently. "Don't talk to him," Whitman shouted, his booming voice echoing through the bus. His frustration seemed to grow with every passing second. From his seat, the young man recording spoke again. "You're just making it worse for yourself," he said, his tone calm. "Everyone's going to see this." Whitman said nothing, his face red with anger. In the background, The faint sound of a siren began to creep into the tense atmosphere, signaling that the situation was about to escalate further. The passengers exchanged uncertain glances, the tension thick enough to feel suffocating. But Evelyn Carter stood firm, her quiet determination a stark contrast to the chaos around her. The piercing wail of the siren grew louder, signaling the approach of transit security. Evelyn Carter remained unmoved, her composed demeanor an unshakable contrast to the turmoil that Robert Whitman seemed determined to incite. The passengers had grown silent, their gazes darting between Evelyn and the driver as the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon them. With a sharp hiss, the bus doors swung open, and Whitman, flushed and visibly agitated, prepared to hand over control. Evelyn, on the other hand, stood tall, her back straight and her chin held high. Her quiet defiance was unyielding. "We'll see what they have to say," Evelyn said softly, her words laced with steely determination. As the siren faded into silence, the oppressive tension inside the bus reached its peak. All eyes remained fixed on Evelyn, a steadfast figure gripping the rail near the front. Whitman retreated to his seat, though his furtive glances toward her betrayed his simmering frustration. From the middle rows, a young mother sighed audibly, her voice breaking the thick silence. "Why doesn't she just move?" she murmured, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is holding everyone up." "She's right," a man beside her added quietly, his tone tinged with exasperation. "It's not worth the hassle." Evelyn turned slightly in their direction, her gaze calm but firm. "Some battles are worth fighting," she replied simply, her voice steady. She met the mother's hesitant eyes briefly, before turning her attention forward once more. The young man with the phone, still recording, leaned forward. "She's got a point," he said, his tone challenging but measured. "Why's he even bothering her? She's not doing anything wrong." Whitman's glare shot toward him like a knife. "Stay out of it, kid! This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't it?" the man retorted, his voice unwavering. "You've made it everyone's problem by stopping the bus." A few passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. Toward the front, a teenage girl whispered to the woman beside her, her tone incredulous. "I can't believe this is happening. It's like something from a history textbook." The woman nodded, her voice equally hushed but resolute. "Except this isn't history. This is now." The sound of approaching footsteps filled the air, as the tension reached a breaking point. The bus door swung open again, this time admitting two transit security officers clad in crisp uniforms. Their presence, framed by the bright morning sunlight pouring through the open doors, immediately commanded attention. Whitman sprang to his feet, pointing an accusatory finger at Evelyn. "Finally!" he barked, his voice laden with self-righteousness. "She's been refusing to comply, holding up the bus and causing a scene." The officers exchanged glances before focusing on Evelyn. Their expressions were neutral, professional. One of them spoke first, his tone measured. "Ma'am, we've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you explain what's going on?" Evelyn stood firm, her posture unyielding as she addressed the officers. "I paid my fare, like everyone else here," she began, her voice calm but deliberate. "He demanded I move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his own prejudice." "That's not true," Whitman interjected, his voice rising in agitation. "I told her these seats are priority seats. She doesn't belong here." Evelyn's gaze sharpened as she responded, her words cutting through the escalating tension. "Priority for whom? The elderly? I certainly qualify. Or are there other criteria I don't meet?" The first officer hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding drama. Passengers nodded subtly in agreement with Evelyn's words, their expressions betraying quiet support. Meanwhile, the young man with the phone angled his camera to capture every detail. The officers, Whitman, and Evelyn, all in the frame. "Ma'am," the second officer said, his voice placating, "the easiest solution would be to move to another seat. We're just trying to resolve this without further delay." Evelyn didn't flinch. "I'm not the one delaying this bus," she replied firmly. "He is. And if I step off now, he'll think he can keep treating people like this. I won't let that happen." The bus grew even quieter, the passengers now watching with rapt attention. The teenage girl who had whispered earlier suddenly stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. "She's right," she exclaimed. "Why should she have to move? He's the one causing the problem." "Sit down," Whitman barked, his frustration boiling over. "You want to get thrown off too? That's enough," the first officer interjected sharply, holding up a hand to silence Whitman. "We'll handle this." From his seat, the young man with the phone spoke up again, his tone unwavering. "Everyone's going to see this, man. This video will be everywhere by tonight." Murmurs rippled through the bus, passengers voicing their agreement. Toward the back, a man in a suit finally broke his silence, his voice firm. "This is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong. Just let her stay where she is, and we can all get on with our day." Whitman's face turned a deeper shade of red. His fists clenched tightly. "Rules are rules," he spat. "You can't just let anyone sit here." "Anyone?" Evelyn countered, her voice piercing the growing commotion. "Or just people who look like me?" The bus fell silent once more, her words landing like a thunderclap. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, curious about the unfolding scene. The young man with the phone aimed his camera toward the window, capturing the growing interest from pedestrians. "We need to make a decision," the second officer said finally, his voice strained. "Ma'am, are you willing to step off the bus so we can de-escalate this situation?" Evelyn's shoulders straightened as she held her ground. "No," she replied firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated this way. Not today." The officers hesitated, their authority momentarily at odds with the resolve of the elderly woman before them. Whitman, shaking his head in frustration, muttered under his breath as he sank back into his seat. The tension on the bus remained palpable, the standoff far from over. The atmosphere on the bus was electric, every passenger sitting on edge as the standoff continued to unfold. Outside, the gathering crowd grew larger, their murmurs blending with the sounds of car horns and distant street chatter. Evelyn Carter remained a symbol of quiet defiance, her poised demeanor speaking louder than any argument. She stood as a pillar of resolve in the midst of chaos, refusing to be moved by the injustice she faced. The crowd beyond the bus now spilled onto the sidewalk, their murmurs growing louder and carrying through the open doors. Inside, tension simmered. Passengers fidgeted in their seats, their unease palpable as they watched the scene unfold. Evelyn's unyielding stance, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering, contrasted starkly with the frustration etched on Robert Whitman's face. One of the officers finally broke the silence, turning to Whitman with a weary sigh. "Sir," he said, his voice measured, "what exactly do you want us to do here? She's not being aggressive or threatening anyone." Whitman threw his hands up in frustration. "Are you kidding me? She's refusing to follow instructions," he snapped. "How am I supposed to do my job with someone like her sitting up here, disrupting everything?" A young woman sitting near the middle of the bus couldn't hold back any longer. Her voice trembled, but it carried a note of defiance. "You're the one making a scene, not her," she called out. Several passengers murmured their agreement, their voices rising in subtle support. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood again, clutching the seat in front of her for balance. "Yeah," she said, her voice louder this time. "She's just sitting there. What's the big deal?" Whitman's eyes flashed with anger as he turned on her. "You want me to throw you off too? Sit down and stay out of it," he barked. The officer nearest to Whitman raised a hand to calm him. "Let's keep this civil," he said firmly, though his tone hinted at exhaustion. He turned back to Evelyn, addressing her in a softer voice. "Ma'am, are you sure you won't reconsider? Moving to another seat might make things easier for everyone." Evelyn's gaze didn't falter. "I've done nothing wrong," she replied evenly. "If I move, it'll only make things easier for him, not for everyone else. And I won't give him that satisfaction." The weight of her words hung in the air, broken only by the sound of a phone chiming. The young man who had been recording the confrontation smirked and held up his device. "Looks like it's already online," he announced, his voice carrying a hint of triumph. "Over 1,000 views in just 5 minutes. Whitman's face darkened further, his jaw tightening as his anger boiled to the surface. "You put this on the internet?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Damn right I did. The young man shot back, unfazed. People need to see this. You can't treat people like this and expect to get away with it. The passengers murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. Even those who had remained silent until now began to voice their support. Toward the back, a man in a suit finally spoke up, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't 1955, he said sharply. "She has every right to sit wherever she wants." Whitman slammed his fist against the dashboard with a loud thud, the sound silencing the murmurs. "I've had enough," he shouted. "She's off this bus, or we're not going anywhere." The officers stiffened at his outburst, their patience wearing thin. The first officer stepped closer to Whitman, his expression hardening. "Sir, if you keep escalating this, you're going to be the one facing consequences," he warned. "You called us to handle this situation, so let us do our job." Outside, the growing crowd pressed closer to the bus, their curiosity shifting to indignation. Some raised their phones to record, while others began shouting questions. "What's going on in there?" A man in a construction vest called out. "Why isn't the bus moving?" "Driver's being a racist jerk," someone yelled from the back of the bus, drawing cheers and laughter from the crowd. The second officer rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. He turned to Evelyn, his tone soft but insistent. "Ma'am, I understand your position, and I don't blame you, but this is getting bigger by the minute. Are you sure you want to keep this going?" Evelyn glanced out the window at the crowd, their faces a mixture of outrage and curiosity. Her eyes swept across the passengers, some looking at her with quiet sympathy, others with impatience. Finally, she turned to the young man recording and gave him a small, resolute nod. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me. It's about what's right." The officer straightened, his expression shifting to reluctant acknowledgement. "All right, ma'am," he said. "Then we'll stay here until this is resolved properly." Whitman let out a bitter laugh. "You're just going to let her get away with this? Unbelievable," he scoffed. The first officer's patience snapped. He turned sharply to Whitman. "One more outburst, and I'll report you for misconduct," he said coldly. Whitman fell silent, his face flushed with barely contained fury. Meanwhile, the bus passengers sat riveted, the tension nearly palpable. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd had grown into a rhythmic chant that carried through the open doors. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" they chanted, their voices growing louder with each repetition. Evelyn finally moved to an empty seat near the front, her back straight and her chin held high. Her quiet defiance seemed to radiate strength, a stark contrast to Whitman's barely suppressed rage. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping outside to address the crowd, leaving Whitman fuming and the passengers buzzing with murmurs of approval. The young man with the phone lowered it briefly and grinned. "You're a legend, ma'am," he said, his tone filled with admiration. "This video is going to blow up." Evelyn offered a faint smile but said nothing, her focus still on Whitman. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the momentum seemed to shift in her favor. The officers stepped off the bus, greeted by the rising volume of the chanting crowd. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" echoed louder and louder, a rallying cry that reverberated through the tense air. Inside, Evelyn sat motionless, her resolve unbroken. Whitman gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with anger. The young man with the phone lifted it again, panning across the bus to capture the reactions of the passengers, who now seemed emboldened by the growing support outside. The bus's atmosphere grew heavier as Whitman's frustration spiraled out of control. Outside, the chants of "Let her sit" rang louder, a rhythmic cry of defiance that reverberated through the walls of the vehicle. Inside, passengers exchanged resolute glances, their earlier hesitance giving way to a quiet solidarity. Evelyn Carter, unmoved by the chaos surrounding her, sat poised and calm, her chin held high as she faced the storm with quiet strength. Whitman stood abruptly, his chair groaning under the force, his face a furious shade of crimson. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he growled, his voice low and filled with venom. "You're not. You're just another troublemaker making my life harder." Evelyn didn't flinch, her composure unwavering despite the driver's escalating anger. Her calm seemed to only fuel his fury. "What I am," she said, her voice steady but firm, "is someone who's tired of being pushed around. If you can't handle that, maybe you're in the wrong job." Her words struck like a hammer. Whitman's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white as he took a step toward her. "That's it," he hissed through gritted teeth. "I'm done playing nice." The passengers collectively held their breath as Whitman advanced toward Evelyn, his veins bulging with unrestrained anger. But before he could reach her, a voice rang out from the back of the bus. "Stop!" It was the man in the suit, standing tall, his tone commanding. "You're out of line, driver. Touch her, and you'll have every single one of us standing against you." A murmur of agreement swept through the bus, emboldened voices rising in support. The teenage girl stood once more, defiant in the face of Whitman's intimidation. "Yeah, you're not laying a hand on her," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Whitman froze, his authority eroding in real time as the passengers united against him. His glare darted between Evelyn, the passengers, and the growing crowd outside. The chants of "let her sit" grew deafening, joined now by the occasional honking of passing cars. The young man with the phone recorded every moment, his camera trained on the unfolding drama. "You're finished, man," the young man called out, his tone cutting. "This video's already viral. Everyone's going to see what you're doing." Whitman's jaw tightened, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the situation. Outside, the sea of protesters pressed closer, their chants now accompanied by signs demanding justice. One sign in bold letters read, "Justice for Evelyn," while another, scrawled hastily on cardboard, declared, "End the hate." The first officer re-entered the bus, his expression hardened by the gravity of the situation. "Driver," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument, "this ends now. Stand down before you make this any worse." Whitman turned to the officer, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't get it. She's defying my authority. I can't just let her." "You've lost control," the officer interrupted, his voice firm and unyielding. "The crowd outside isn't on your side. The passengers aren't on your side. If you continue, you'll face consequences far worse than this." Whitman opened his mouth to protest, but stopped short, his face a mask of rage and helplessness. The officer gestured toward Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softening, "you've made your point clear. Please, remain seated. We'll handle things from here." Evelyn nodded slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "I wasn't planning on moving," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet conviction that had carried her through the ordeal. The officer stepped back, addressing the passengers. "We appreciate your patience as we work to resolve this situation. Please remain calm." The bus fell into a tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic chants outside. Whitman slumped back into his seat, glaring at the steering wheel as though it were to blame for his downfall. His authority, once absolute in his confined domain, had crumbled under the weight of his actions. The young man with the phone lowered his camera briefly, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. "You're a legend," he said softly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "This is going to change things." Evelyn didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed out the window where the crowd continued to grow. "It's not about being a legend," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's about doing what's right." Outside, the protesters' chants swelled, their unified voices demanding justice. The officers moved to address the crowd, their radios crackling with updates. The tension on the bus lingered, but it was clear that the tide had shifted irrevocably. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in her seat, her quiet defiance a symbol of resilience. Around her, the passengers seemed to sit a little taller, their earlier discomfort replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The world was watching, and they were witnessing history unfold. The bus was electric, the air charged with the energy of triumph and justice finally served. Robert Whitman, once an overbearing figure of authority, was now a deposed tyrant, led away in handcuffs as the crowd outside roared with approval. Cameras and smartphones captured every moment of his disgrace, ensuring that his actions and the consequences would not be forgotten. Inside the bus, Evelyn Carter remained seated at the front, her composure unbroken despite the physical and emotional ordeal she had endured. Her hand briefly rubbed the spot on her arm where Whitman had grabbed her, but the faint pain did nothing to shake her resolve. She sat as she always had, poised, dignified, and resolute. The young man with the phone approached her cautiously, his earlier bravado replaced with genuine concern. His camera was still rolling, but his focus had shifted. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with respect. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone steady and unshaken. A faint smile played at her lips. "It takes more than that to break me." The teenage girl, who had been one of Evelyn's most vocal supporters during the standoff, stepped forward, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. "You were amazing," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." Evelyn's gaze swept across the passengers, many of whom were now leaning forward in their seats, their expressions a mix of admiration and gratitude. "It wasn't just for me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Sometimes you have to take a stand, even when it's uncomfortable. Otherwise, nothing changes." Her words resonated deeply, the weight of their truth settling over the bus like a warm blanket. The man in the suit, who had remained quiet for much of the confrontation, now spoke up, his tone carrying the gravity of the moment. "You've got more courage than most people, Mrs. Carter," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Today, you inspired all of us." That man deserved everything he got. Evelyn nodded slightly, her eyes thoughtful. "It's not about deserving," she said. "It's about accountability. People like him need to understand that they don't get to treat others as less. Not anymore." The replacement driver, a young woman with kind eyes, climbed aboard. She adjusted her hat and glanced at Evelyn, a smile of quiet respect lighting up her face. "Where to next?" she asked, her tone light but deferential. Evelyn relaxed slightly in her seat, her shoulders easing for the first time since the confrontation began. She leaned back and let out a slow breath. "Forward," she said simply. Outside, the crowd continued to cheer, their chants shifting to celebrate Evelyn Carter by name. Signs waved in the air, declaring "Justice for Evelyn" and "Stand Against Hate." The reporter who had pushed her way to the front earlier now spoke animatedly into her camera, broadcasting the story to a wider audience. The police cruiser carrying Robert Whitman sped away, its sirens wailing faintly as it disappeared down the street. Inside, Whitman sat seething, his protests and claims of authority drowned out by the weight of his own actions. The media would have the last word now, and his shame would echo far beyond this single bus route. Back on the bus, the energy had shifted entirely. The passengers, who had begun the day as quiet observers, now buzzed with relief and a shared sense of triumph. Strangers exchanged smiles and nods, their solidarity born from witnessing history together. The young man with the phone leaned toward Evelyn once more. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, "I just want you to know, this is going to change things. People are going to see this and think twice about staying silent." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Good," she said. "That's the point. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice to remind others they have one too." The teenage girl, still clutching her backpack, looked up at Evelyn with wide eyes. "You're a hero," she said simply. Evelyn smiled, shaking her head. "I'm just someone who got tired of being quiet," she replied. "If that makes me a hero, then maybe it's time we had more of them." The bus rumbled back to life, the sound of its engine cutting through the lingering chants outside. As it pulled away from the curb, the crowd erupted into applause once more, their cheers following the bus as it merged into the flow of traffic. Evelyn Carter, seated firmly at the front, became more than just a passenger that day. She was a symbol of defiance, a beacon of resilience, and a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward to create waves of change. And as the bus carried its passengers forward, leaving the chaotic scene behind, one thing was clear: the world had watched, and it would not forget. The bus had long since moved on, but the echoes of what transpired reverberated far beyond its route. Evelyn Carter had unknowingly sparked a movement, her quiet defiance resonating with millions across the globe. By the next day, Her name dominated headlines, her image plastered across screens, and her story igniting a wave of public outrage. The video captured by the young man on the bus had gone viral, garnering millions of views and sparking hashtags like Nadartwa Justice for Evelyn and Dardfa End Transit Racism. News outlets looped the now infamous footage of Robert Whitman grabbing Evelyn from her seat, followed by his swift arrest. Protests formed outside the city's transit authority headquarters, with demonstrators demanding accountability not only for Whitman, but for the entire system that had allowed his actions to persist. Evelyn, however, remained composed amid the media frenzy. While others channeled their energy into the public discourse, she focused on the next step, ensuring true justice was served. That afternoon, Evelyn sat in her modest living room, her phone vibrating incessantly with calls, texts, and notifications. Reporters clamored for interviews, activists extended offers of support, and strangers flooded her social media with messages of solidarity. Despite the overwhelming attention, Evelyn's focus was unwavering. Her lawyer, Angela Martin, arrived shortly after noon, her presence exuding confidence and calm. Angela, a civil rights attorney in her mid-30s known for her tenacity, had reached out to Evelyn after seeing the viral video. Now, she laid out a series of documents on Evelyn's coffee table, her expression a blend of determination and resolve. "This case isn't just about Whitman," Angela said, her finger tapping a file labeled Transit Authority Misconduct Complaints. "It's about a system that protected him. He has a history, racial profiling, verbal abuse, multiple complaints, but the Transit Authority swept every single one under the rug. They enabled him." Evelyn nodded, her gaze steady. "Then it's not just him we're holding accountable. It's the entire system that allowed him to get away with it." "Exactly," Angela replied, her eyes gleaming with approval. "We're not just charging Whitman with assault. We're filing a case against the Transit Authority for negligence and fostering a discriminatory culture." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you think we can win?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with concern. Angela's gaze didn't waver. "With the public on our side? Yes, but it won't be easy. The Transit Authority is already circling the wagons. They'll try to discredit you, make this about something else." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "They can try," she said firmly, "but the truth is out there. People saw what happened. They can't erase that." Angela nodded. "And we'll make sure of it. We've got the video, witness statements, and Whitman's arrest. It's a strong foundation, but your testimony will be crucial." Evelyn's eyes burned with quiet resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the days that followed, Evelyn and Angela worked tirelessly to prepare for the trial. Witnesses from the bus began coming forward, each adding a piece to the puzzle. The teenage girl who had stood up to Whitman provided a vivid account of the confrontation, her testimony highlighting the fear and courage she had felt. The young man who had recorded the video shared not only his footage, but also his perspective as someone who refused to remain silent. Their accounts painted a damning picture of Whitman's behavior and the culture of impunity that had enabled him. The Transit Authority, however, was not going down without a fight. Public relations teams scrambled to manage the fallout, issuing carefully worded statements and emphasizing their commitment to inclusivity and diversity. Yet these words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. Meanwhile, Evelyn became a reluctant figurehead for the growing movement. Though she shied away from the limelight, her quiet dignity and firm resolve resonated deeply with people across the nation. Activists rallied behind her cause, using her story as a rallying cry for systemic change. Protests grew in size and frequency, demanding not only justice for Evelyn, but a complete overhaul of the Transit Authority's policies and leadership. The day of the trial loomed closer, and with it, the pressure mounted. Angela guided Evelyn through each step, ensuring she was prepared to face the court. "They'll try to rattle you," Angela warned during one of their late-night meetings. "Stick to the truth. Don't let them twist your words." "I won't," Evelyn assured her. "I've lived the truth. That's what I'll speak." By the time the trial began, Public interest had reached a fever pitch. News outlets covered the proceedings extensively, framing it as a landmark case for civil rights. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their signs and chants echoing the demands for accountability. Inside, Evelyn stood as a beacon of strength, her testimony unflinching as she recounted the events of that day on the bus. The Transit Authority's legal team tried every tactic, minimizing Whitman's actions, questioning Evelyn's motives, and attempting to shift blame. But the evidence was irrefutable. The video footage, the eyewitness testimonies, and Whitman's own history painted a clear picture of systemic failure. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom erupted into cheers. Whitman was found guilty of assault, and the Transit Authority was held liable for its role in perpetuating discrimination. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community, sparking similar investigations into other transit systems across the country. For Evelyn, the victory was bittersweet. While justice had been served, she knew the fight was far from over. Yet as she stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the change she had inspired. The young man with the phone was waiting among the throng. He approached Evelyn, his camera lowered but his admiration evident. "You did it," he said simply. Evelyn smiled faintly, her expression resolute. "We did it," she replied, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And this is just the beginning." The journey for justice was long, but Evelyn Carter had proven that one voice, when joined by others, could spark a revolution. The courtroom was tense as the young man with the phone continued his testimony, his voice steady despite the pressure of the moment. "Because I've seen stuff like this happen before," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering as it swept across the jury. "People like him," he gestured toward Whitman, "think they can get away with treating others like they're less than human. I wanted to make sure this time there was proof." Angela Martin, standing beside him, nodded approvingly. She turned back to the jury. "And what made you decide to step in, beyond recording the video?" He hesitated for a moment, his voice softening. "Because it wasn't right. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Someone had to stand up, and if it wasn't me, then who?" Angela smiled faintly at his words, then glanced toward the jury. No further questions. The defense attorney approached next, his posture confident, but his expression tight with frustration. "Mr. Garcia," he began, addressing the young man, "you were recording this for your social media, weren't you? Hoping for a little attention?" The young man's jaw tightened. "No," he said firmly. "I recorded it so people would know the truth. If you'd been there, you'd know that." The defense attorney tried to press further, questioning the young man's intentions and attempting to paint him as an opportunist. But every line of questioning was met with the same calm, measured responses. By the time the young man stepped down, it was clear that his testimony and the video evidence he provided had left a powerful impression on the jury. As the trial continued, Angela presented a series of witnesses, each one adding to the mounting case against Whitman and the Transit Authority. The middle-aged woman who had hesitated to speak up during the incident admitted, under oath, that she had witnessed Whitman treating other passengers poorly in the past. "I always thought it wasn't my place to say anything," she confessed, her voice heavy with regret. "But after what he did to Mrs. Carter, I realized staying silent only makes it worse." Angela nodded, her voice steady as she asked, "Do you believe this behavior reflects an isolated incident or a larger problem within the Transit Authority?" The woman hesitated but then spoke with conviction. "It's a pattern, and the system lets it happen." The defense attempted to undermine her testimony, suggesting that her memory might be flawed or her judgment clouded by bias. But Angela skillfully countered, reinforcing the credibility of the witness and highlighting the consistency of her account with others presented. When Evelyn Carter finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Every eye was on her as she raised her right hand and took her oath. She sat tall, her demeanor as composed as it had been on the day of the incident. Angela approached her with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Carter," she began, "can you describe, in your own words, what happened on the morning of the incident?" Evelyn recounted the events with clarity and precision, her voice steady as she detailed how Whitman had berated her, demanded she move, and eventually grabbed her arm. She paused briefly before continuing, her tone unwavering. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I paid my fare like everyone else, and I had every right to sit where I chose. He singled me out because of who I am, and I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. Angela nodded. What was going through your mind when he grabbed you? Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly to the jury, her expression somber. I thought about all the times I've seen people like me stay silent because they were afraid of the consequences. I knew that if I didn't stand up, nothing would ever change. Angela smiled faintly, her respect for Evelyn evident. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. No further questions. The defense, as expected, sought to discredit Evelyn's testimony. They questioned her motives, implied that she had escalated the situation, and suggested that she had misinterpreted Whitman's actions. But Evelyn remained calm and composed, her responses concise and unwavering. I didn't escalate anything, she said firmly when pressed. I stood my ground because it was the right thing to do. That's not provocation, it's dignity. The trial's most pivotal moment came when Angela presented a document revealing a pattern of complaints against Whitman. The file included multiple reports of racial profiling and verbal abuse, all of which the Transit Authority had dismissed or ignored. The jury's reaction was palpable. Expressions of shock and indignation rippled through the room. Angela addressed the court directly. This isn't about one man's actions on one day. This is about a system that has allowed discrimination and abuse to persist unchecked. Today, you have the power to send a message that no one is above accountability and that injustice has no place in our society. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their closing arguments. Whitman's lawyer continued to argue that the incident had been exaggerated, framing his client as a man simply trying to do his job. But Angela's closing statement resonated deeply. This case is about more than Evelyn Carter, she said, her voice strong and clear. It's about the countless others who have been silenced by fear or dismissed by a system that should protect them. Today, we have the chance to stand with her and say, enough. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension inside the courthouse palpable as everyone awaited their decision. Finally, they returned, and the verdict was announced. Robert Whitman was found guilty of assault, and the Transit Authority was held liable for negligence and fostering a culture of discrimination. Cheers erupted outside the courthouse as the news spread. Inside, Evelyn Carter allowed herself a small, relieved smile. The fight was far from over, but today, justice had taken a significant step forward. As she stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by a sea of supporters, she knew that this victory was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, but found their voice through her. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Angela Martin leaned forward, her gaze locked onto Robert Whitman. Explain to the court how grabbing a seated, unthreatening passenger aligns with any policy you claim to enforce, she said, her voice sharp but controlled. Whitman squirmed in his seat, his face reddening. I was trying to defuse the situation, he stammered. She wasn't listening, and it was disrupting the bus. Angela raised an eyebrow, her tone turning incredulous. Diffuse the situation by physically dragging a senior citizen from her seat. You believe that was an appropriate response? Whitman's lawyer quickly interjected. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, the judge nodded. Sustained. Ms. Martin, rephrase. Angela took a step back, her expression unreadable. Mr. Whitman, she began again, her tone softer but no less pointed, did you consider, at any point, stopping to ask yourself if your actions were justified? Whitman hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. I was following my instincts, he said finally. I thought I was doing the right thing. Angela's eyes narrowed. And do you still think that? Whitman hesitated again, his gaze darting toward his lawyer for support. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela let the silence stretch, the weight of his admission sinking in. Then she turned back to the jury, her voice firm. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about instincts or split-second decisions. This is about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that Mr. Whitman has demonstrated time and time again. She held up the stack of complaints once more. 5 years. Multiple documented incidents of racial profiling, verbal abuse, and discriminatory behavior. And each time, the Transit Authority did nothing. They allowed this pattern to continue, which ultimately led to what happened to Mrs. Carter. Angela's words hung in the air, the weight of her argument undeniable. She turned back to Whitman for one final question. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "do you regret your actions that day?" Whitman's face contorted with frustration. "I regret that it's come to this," he said, his tone defensive. "I regret that my intentions are being twisted." Angela nodded, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Whitman stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. His testimony had done little to bolster his defense, and Angela's skillful cross-examination had only deepened the jury's doubts about his credibility. The next phase of the trial shifted focus to the Transit Authority itself. Angela presented evidence of systemic negligence, memos and internal emails that revealed a pattern of ignoring complaints against drivers like Whitman. A former employee of the Transit Authority, now a whistleblower, testified about the organization's lax approach to addressing misconduct. "They didn't want the bad press," the whistleblower explained. "Every time a complaint came in, they'd sweep it under the rug. Drivers like Whitman knew they could get away with anything." The jury's expressions grew darker as the extent of the Transit Authority's complicity became clear. Evelyn Carter watched the proceedings quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When the defense tried to redirect attention away from the Transit Authority, Angela countered each argument with precision and evidence. Every point she made brought the case closer to its inevitable conclusion, that both Whitman and the system enabling him were guilty of gross misconduct. In her closing arguments, Angela addressed the jury one last time. "This trial is about accountability," she said, her voice resonating through the courtroom. "It's about a man who abused his authority and a system that allowed him to do so unchecked." Mrs. Carter stood up for herself that day, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Now, it's your turn to stand with her and ensure that justice is served. The defense's closing arguments, while polished, failed to dispel the overwhelming evidence against their client. The video footage, the witness testimonies, and the damning history of complaints all painted a clear picture. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned, the verdict was read. Robert Whitman was found guilty of assault, and the Transit Authority was held liable for fostering a discriminatory culture. Damages were awarded to Evelyn Carter, and the ruling included a mandate for systemic reform within the Transit Authority. The courtroom erupted into applause as the verdict was announced. Evelyn sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. As she left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers, chanting her name. Evelyn Carter had become a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope in the fight against systemic injustice. She raised her hand in a small wave, her quiet dignity radiating strength. Change had begun, and Evelyn Carter had ensured the world would never forget the day one voice turned into a movement. The courtroom had transformed into a scene of subdued celebration, the weight of the verdict settling over everyone present. Evelyn Carter, her hands still neatly folded in her lap, let out a quiet sigh of relief. Though her expression remained composed, the slightest quiver in her lips hinted at the immense emotional journey she had endured. Beside her, Angela Martin offered a firm but reassuring pat on her shoulder, her face betraying a sense of hard-won triumph. As the judge adjourned the court for the day, Evelyn rose from her seat with a dignity that mirrored the strength she had shown throughout the trial. Around her, murmurs of approval and congratulations swirled. The fight had been long and grueling, but justice had been served, not just for Evelyn but for everyone who had felt the sting of discrimination in silence. Outside, the courthouse steps were teeming with activity. Protesters, supporters, and reporters created a cacophony of chants, cheers, and camera shutters. Signs emblazoned with messages like "Justice for Evelyn" and "End Transit Racism" waved high in the air. The energy was palpable, a mixture of celebration and resolve to continue the fight for systemic change. Evelyn emerged into the sunlight flanked by Angela and a small group of supporters. The crowd erupted into applause as she stepped forward, her presence commanding respect. Reporters surged forward, their microphones and cameras thrust toward her as questions flew from every direction. "Mrs. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Evelyn paused, her posture straight and her chin held high. She took a moment to absorb the scene before speaking, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I feel grateful," she began, her words carrying over the noise. "Grateful not just for myself, but for everyone who stood with me. This isn't just my victory, it's ours." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unison to celebrate the moment. Evelyn glanced toward Angela, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "This case wasn't just about one incident or one person," Evelyn continued. "It was about a pattern of injustice, a system that allowed discrimination to go unchecked for far too long. Today, we took a step toward holding that system accountable, but there's still work to be done." Her words were met with another round of applause, the crowd feeding off her quiet strength. One reporter pressed forward, her notepad poised. "Mrs. Carter, what do you hope will happen next?" Evelyn's expression grew more resolute. "I hope this sends a message that no one is above accountability, and that standing up, even when it's hard, can lead to change. I hope this inspires others to speak out, to demand better, and to never settle for silence in the face of injustice." As the crowd erupted into chants of her name, Evelyn stepped back, allowing Angela to address a few additional questions. The young man who had recorded the initial video approached her quietly, his phone now lowered. "You did it, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You really did it." Evelyn turned to him, a faint but warm smile crossing her lips. "We did it," she corrected gently. Every voice made a difference. The teenage girl who had spoken up during the incident joined them, her face flushed with excitement. "You're a hero," she said earnestly, her eyes wide with admiration. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "I'm just someone who decided enough was enough," she said softly. "If that makes me a hero, then maybe it's time for more of us to take a stand." The day ended with Evelyn surrounded by supporters, her quiet strength a beacon of hope for the community. Though the verdict was a victory, she knew it was only the beginning. The fight for systemic change would continue, but Evelyn Carter had proven that one voice, backed by truth and courage, could inspire a movement. And as she left the courthouse steps, the chants of the crowd following her into the warm evening air, Evelyn felt a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't the end, it was the start of something bigger. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, it felt like it was moving in the right direction. The crowd's cheers swelled as Evelyn Carter raised her hand in a quiet wave of acknowledgement. She stood tall amidst the thunderous applause, not as a lone figure, but as the face of a movement that had ignited change. This moment was no longer just about her. It was a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. Evelyn had proven that standing up for what's right could ripple outward, making a difference far beyond the walls of a courtroom. Angela Martin stepped beside her, her voice strong as she addressed the gathered crowd. "This case sends a clear message. No one is above accountability, and no one should have to endure discrimination. Today, justice prevailed, but our work doesn't stop here." The crowd erupted into another wave of applause and chants as Evelyn and Angela descended the courthouse steps. Evelyn knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but she also understood the power of what had been accomplished. She hadn't just won a case, she had sparked a movement. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the trial were undeniable. The Transit Authority, under immense public pressure, announced sweeping reforms aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had come to light. Among the changes were mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, the creation of an independent oversight committee to review misconduct complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Robert Whitman, once a symbol of unchecked prejudice, was sentenced to community service and required to attend anger management classes. His career as a bus driver was effectively over. While his fall from grace was significant, It was the reforms to the system that marked the true victory. The changes ensured that others would not endure what Evelyn had, creating a safer and more equitable environment for all passengers. Evelyn, meanwhile, returned to the quiet rhythms of her life, though she found herself drawn into the larger conversations her case had sparked. Invitations poured in from schools, community centers, and public forums, where she shared her story and spoke about the importance of resilience and standing up for justice. Her presence became a symbol of hope and empowerment, inspiring others to find their voices. At one community event, a young girl approached her shyly, clutching a notebook. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "because of you, I want to stand up for people too." Evelyn knelt down to meet the girl's eyes, her heart swelling with pride. "Never underestimate your voice," she said gently. "It's more powerful than you know." One quiet evening, as Evelyn sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, her phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "We did it. Thank you for trusting me." Evelyn smiled softly, her heart full. The fight had been long and hard, but every moment had been worth it. She had stood her ground, and the world was a better place because of it. As the stars began to emerge in the evening sky, Evelyn closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The road ahead would always have challenges, but she felt prepared to face them. She had proven that courage could inspire change, and the legacy of her stand would continue to echo, reminding the world that justice, when pursued with conviction, could prevail.